you hear the insistence on a two-state solution when it's impossible until Iran and its proxies agree. And they're nowhere near agreeing.
This government this current Labor government that I'm talking about, they remind me a lot of my time in student politics. And what I mean is they view the world in terms of the colonizers and the colonized, the rich and the poor. If you are the poor, you're a victim. If you're rich, you're not. They see Israel as a rich Western state. By the way, it's not really Western. And they see the Israelis as colonizers because they don't know the history about how Israel was formed. They were not the colonizers. But because they've got this framework, regardless of what led to October 7th and beyond, what has led to what's going on now with Iran and Israel, they've got that inherent a priori bias that they do not want to be on the side of so-called colonizers and the wealthy West. And it's a very undergraduate position. Now, that's all fine if you're in university. It's not fine when you're running the country and the foreign policy of the country. So I would say that when it comes to these issues that are now defining our time in history, right from October 7th onwards, Israel, Palestine, Israel, Iran, big changes are happening, and our current government is either not picking it up, is either opposing the sorts of changes that would make the world safer, or, as you say, simply just becoming irrelevant.
It's sort of ideology-driven rather than pragmatic and understanding-driven.
There's something good and bad about Australia being where it is geographically. We can look at the world, we can pontificate. Nothing seems real. Threats don't really seem particularly real. So when Israel says we are facing an existential threat, I don't think that resonates with this government, and I don't think it resonates with a lot of Australians as well. A lot of it has to do with our geography. The strategic arguments and discussions we have, it almost seems abstract and intellectual and optional, as opposed to something which will fundamentally change how the world is governed, how people's lives are lived, how power's distributed. There is an abstraction about the conversation that's going on in Australia, including by the current Labor government.
Just back for a moment to this idea that Israel's evil because it's a colonizer. The concept of colonization in its moral dimension has to do with dispossession. Has there ever been a race that have been more dispossessed more often and more unfairly than the Jewish people, who have just one state now? Every other culture has many states. There's just one Jewish state. And guess which one everyone wants to get rid of? It's them. I would argue that we actually, if we were really thinking humanely, would recognize the massive unfairness that's been visited on the Jewish people simply because they're Jewish, down through the ages, including most horrifically last century.
The Palestinian entities, whether you're talking about Hamas or the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank, they're not as strong as Israel, obviously, in a hard power way. But one way they've been very effective is they have been very effective at defining the narrative. And the narrative they define is that Jews never existed in the Middle East. We know that to be absurd if you know any history, if you know your Bible, which is a historical document. But how often do you hear this notion that the Jews have thrown Palestinians and Arabs out of the Middle East?
It's the other way around.
It's the other way around. The Jews were all around the Middle East. In fact, they've been driven out of everywhere in the Middle East except for Israel. They've had a permanent association with where they are for 4,000 plus years. They're just the historical facts, but that's not the narrative that comes out. So somehow they're positioned as the colonizers, the occupiers. Look, I normally don't like to use blanket terms like anti-Semitism, but the analysis applied to Israel and the Jewish people is different to analysis applied to any other people that I know about. And I can only call it anti-Semitic. That is what it is. But it's fueled by these false narratives that have been very successful they're also being spread, developed, propagated, unfortunately, by our sort of intellectual class, by our academics, who say very similar things and are not, no one really will contest it with them. And finally, I would say in the Australian context, it hasn't been helped by the current government. Now, I remember when October 7th happened, the first thing our Foreign Minister Penny Wall said was to call for Israeli restraint and de-escalation, rushing through a two-state solution and recognition of Palestine after what's happened. The point I'm making is that the government does have some say. When the protests against the memorial or against the event at the Opera House on October the 8th or 9th, whatever it was, honouring the murdered Jews, when there was that massive protest, the government, both state and federal, did nothing. That, I think, set the scene for the sorts of public discussion. So I do think the current government has a lot to answer for on this particular issue.